Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I were able to make miracles, I could point out the differences in 9 minutes between the civil law jurisdiction and the common law jurisdiction. It's what a well-known television show would call Mission Impossible. But I shall do my best. The only thing I wanted to tell you, therefore, is to forgive me if I go, as the French say, par affirmation. That is to say, I shall have to make statements. If there is a discussion afterwards, I shall be more than happy to answer a question. But if I only start to argue, well, the 9 minutes or the 10 minutes will go. Well, therefore, let's try to be operational. If I were to give a title to my intervention, I would speak of the proof of the pudding. It's the proof of the pudding because one certainly cannot start a longer learned discussion about the inquisitorial versus adversarial system and the techniques of procedure in both systems. I only have to say the following. I would like to list a certain number of issues which often arise in international arbitration, which, whilst the scholars discuss about them, the arbitrators carry on happily their own arbitration. They couldn't worry less. Whereas there are other issues a little more troublesome, and on these troublesome issues, then one can speak of still remaining problems between civil law and common law jurisdictions. I must say that even the definition civil law versus common law, it's not entirely correct. I personally would call preferentially for a dichotomy opposing or juxtaposing, one should be careful about the words. I prefer juxtaposing to opposing because not necessarily is there a position. The American style of arbitration and the Western European style of arbitration. We had a third category, which was the socialist countries' arbitration up until the Eastern Bloc resisted to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a peculiar system of arbitration which could be cited as a third kind of arbitration. Now, mainly, the Asian countries, for instance, and other countries of the world do partake the distinction between the American and the European, West European style. What are the issues on which the differences are likely to arise? I'm going to be obviously very brief. The crucial issue remains discovery. You all know what discovery is. That is to say, the possibility for one party to ask the other party or to ask the arbitrator or the judge to order the other party to submit documents, documents which may be in the order of the millions, of the hundreds of thousands, of the thousands, of the tens. Well, there comes the first difference. The Americans have a very wide notion of discovery. One may count by the number of millions the photocopies or the xerocopies which are asked. But above all, they have the possibility of asking, for instance, for the submission of all documents pertaining to the issues which are under discussion. This is hardly admitted in, let's say, Western European, forgive me, I shall always say Western European, British, and UK, and American. It's hardly admitted in, hardly, it's a figure of speech, is not admitted, let's be more precise, under the Western European systems, also because it may include documents which are prejudicial or harmful to the party which is requested to submit them. This hurts against the constitutional principle in many European countries. On the contrary, it does not find any difficulty under the UK system. But the scope, the amount of the documents which can be required is much less. I was just telling our chairman that I had the privilege of participating in an arbitration with an eminent, well-known, I would say, English semi-god was Lord Wilberforce. And Lord Wilberforce was every time, he was a chairman obviously, and when I was protesting against the extent of the discovery asked by the American parties, usually Lord Wilberforce was upholding my position. There's only one time in which I was caught when I was arguing very brilliantly that the other party was having or seeking a fishing expedition. Then the old gentleman, Lord Wilberforce, said, yes, it may be so, but sometimes, you know, in fishing expeditions, sometimes one does catch fish. Therefore, he admitted it, but to a limited extent. To give an example, the tragedy of an attorney. If you are a European attorney, let's take an Italian attorney, I know what I'm talking about. If I am asked to submit a document which is against the interest of my client, if I do so, I act against the profession of ethics. If I am a common lawyer and I am asked to submit a document against, and I don't do so, I violate the code of ethics. So that's very lovely if you find yourself in such a predicament. You may be called a preacher of a code of ethics under one system and the opposite under the other system. How does one overcome that? I think one does overcome that in a very simple way, by using good sense. I think that the rules which are established in international arbitration should provide for a modicum of discovery. The parties should be aware of the cultural differences and should behave accordingly. In other words, where the principles are still so radically different, the parties should overcome the difficulty by allowing the arbitrators to use good sense, which is done under the IBA rules, under the rules, the ICC rules, under many of the rules, under the European Bank of Investments, the World Bank. In other words, there is always what I call a cultural compromise. And once I remember, I had the privilege of teaching and studying at Michigan Law School, and I was a pupil of Bill Bishop. Bill Bishop was a great professor of international law, whom I always revere. And when I wrote an article in memoriam of Bill Bishop, I used this terminology: cultural neutrality and cultural compromise, a prerequisite to arbitral justice. In other words, the parties and the arbitrators should find in themselves the way to overcome those difficulties. There is another difficulty, and then two more and I shall be finished, which does distinguish the American and West European, including among, if I'm not committing a mortal sin, could I include the UK among the Western Europeans? Thank you. So